Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our summer series, week 11, as we continue our study on the heroes of faith. This group of people in Hebrews 11 that the Hebrews writer believes has shown and demonstrated great faith in the way that they acted. We're most of the way down that list right now, and we're in a section where the Hebrews writer just sort of rapid fire is listing off people who have demonstrated this great faith, and he's not going into precisely what they've done. And Gideon's in this list, and so he's in the Hall of Fame. Maybe he's not Babe Ruth, maybe he's Dennis Eckersley or someone of that caliber, but he still has demonstrated great faith in the way that he's acted. And so that's what we want to do tonight. Is I want to look at who Gideon was, why what he did was credited to him as faith, and what that means for our walk with the Lord. And to understand first who Gideon was, we have to understand what is a judge. And so Gideon comes in the book of Judges, chapters 6 through 8, and what we understand about Judges is coming right on the heels of the Israelites' conquest of the Holy Land. But at the end of Joshua, we see some instances where the Israelites did not completely drive out the Canaanites and other groups of people. And the group of people that in particular are going to be impacting Gideon and Israel is going to be the Midianites and the Amalekites. And we know that these groups of people weren't driven out of the land, and we see this in the beginning of Judges, in Judges 1:19. We see that the reason that they were unable to drive them out is that there was this inability of the Israelites in terms of their technological achievement. The groups in the low-lying regions had, it says, chariots of iron. And so we know that for this to be important, we know that the Israelites did not have this. And so for the Israelites to drive these people out, they had to rely and trust entirely on God. And we know that that was where the Israelites were starting to wane and to lose favor with God, because they weren't continuing to follow in the way that they were supposed to. And so this becomes a sticking point. And then further down in the first chapter of Judges, we see this list of cities that were in fact not conquered by the tribes of Israel, or cities where the men and women were not completely driven out, either for strategic reasons or because they were unable to because of their lack of faith. And so it's in this environment that Israel is trying to hold on to power. And we see this list of different judges that are continuing to have to deliver Israel from one attacker and usurper after another, beginning in chapter 3 with Othniel, and then continuing on through several of the other judges. While I am not confident that Judges is written in a actual chronological order, the biblical chronology that we're looking at to get to Judges 6 as we go Othniel, then we have Ehud, Shamgar, and then we have Deborah and Barak, and finally we get to Gideon in chapter 6. And so in Gideon, we're actually getting to meet these two groups of people, the Midianites and the Amalekites, and they're not in the earlier stories in Judges. And so without having to go into too much detail, what we can know is that this pattern that the Israelites have fallen into is that they are delivered from a group of people by a judge who is sort of a ruler of sorts of a tribe, but not specifically not a king of Israel. And this person brings them back to the glory that God wants for them, and then inevitably after that person dies, we see the Israelites fall away. So it's in this environment that the Midianites and the Amalekites are continually raiding the tribes of Israel, and in particularly the tribe of Manasseh, which is the tribe that Gideon comes from. So whenever an angel of the Lord goes to Gideon Gideon remarks that he is the least of the brothers, in the least of the families, in the least of the tribes. And so his question is, why me? Why would God choose me? And we know the answer is that it's not for the glory of Gideon. It's for the glory of God that he did not choose the greatest brother of the greatest family of the greatest tribe, but instead brings those who are humble and those who are low, and brings them to glory in order to show the greatness of God. And so this is explained to Gideon by the angel of the Lord. And so Gideon shows faith immediately by wanting to provide an offering for this angel of the Lord. And this is in Judges chapter 6. And the angel of the Lord asks him to show some pretty immediate faith and a very specific action. He says, I want you to go and tear down the Baal altar and the Asherah pole that are your father's. And Gideon does it. He just goes and takes care of business at great potential loss to him. Right? The Israelites are mad. They are out for blood, and Gideon's father protects him to an extent. He says if Baal is mad about his altar being torn down, then let Baal take care of it, and he renames Gideon Jerubbaal, and we see this towards the tail end of chapter 6. But in this, we know that Gideon understands that he has been called and set apart by God in order to do something great. But he wants to test and make sure that that's true, and so he does this thing that we're all familiar with, where he tests God by asking him. First, he says, I'm going to lay out a piece of fleece. And what I want you to do, God, is I want you to make dew settle on the fleece, but not on the land around it. So he wakes up in the morning, and sure enough, that is what has happened. Gideon wrings out the fleece and is able to get a full bowl of water out of it. And then he wants to test God once again, and he says, don't let your anger boil over at me, but I want to ask one more time. And I actually think this is a smart experiment here, whether or not it shows full faith, is if it happened one way one morning, he asks for the exact opposite thing to happen the next morning. So it's not a natural occurrence. He says, I want the next morning for the fleece to be dry and for the ground around it to be wet. And so God makes that happen. And so Gideon knows he has been called, and so he's ready. And so as we move into chapter 7 of Judges, we see Gideon getting his army ready. So he has 32,000 men, and he's going out to set upon a group of Midianites and Amalekites that is over 120,000 men strong. And we know this from chapter 8. And so that's not great odds, 32,000 against 120, but maybe if they're strong fighting men and near their homes, where the others are sort of nomadic raiders, maybe they can drive them back. And maybe they can do it by earthly means. And so God says, this is too many, because the Israelites may think too much of themselves. So he says to Gideon, ask any that are afraid to go home. So 22,000 of his forces leave. So he's gone from 32,000 down to just 10,000. So there's really not good odds now. Now instead of 1 to 4, you're 1 to 12. God says that's still not enough. So I want you to take them down to the river, and then I will tell you how I want them to set apart. So they go down to the river. The men stop to drink. 300 of them lap up the water, while the rest get down on their knees to drink. And God says, I want you to take those 300 that lapped up the water, and they're going to be your soldiers. I want you to send the rest on. And so now we're at 300, where we once were 32,000. That's some pretty significant social distancing, 1/100th of your original capacity. But we end up at this ability of Gideon to say, I will go in against the Midianites, 300 against 120 plus thousand, and I will do it because God has asked me. But before he does, God tells him, if you feel the need, you can go into the camp tonight and you will see a sign. So he goes into the camp with his servant, and he overhears a Midianite retelling his dream. And in the dream, you see a couple things happen, and one of the Midianites interprets the dream, and he says the dream means that Midian has been delivered over to Gideon and that the camp will fall. So Gideon's emboldened by this. He goes back, he gets his 300 men ready. They've got trumpets in their right hand, torches in their left. And so they creep up on the camp of Midian. They unleash their torches, they blow their trumpets, and the men of Midian are scattered. They're in disarray, they're stabbing each other, and they're running as fast as they can towards the Jordan River, where Gideon has sent word on to Ephraim and some of the other men of the tribes of Israel. That's where they'll run into their main force. And so in this one sort of fell swoop, 120,000 Midianites are slaughtered. There's 15,000 remaining. They travel northward. There's a little bit of infighting as you move into the start of chapter 8, where the men of Ephraim are mad. They say, why didn't you bring us for this original thing? Because they know that their glory has been lessened and the glory of Gideon is higher. But Gideon is a smooth operator here, and he says, well, what glory do I have? We didn't kill any of these men. You killed these two great men among the Midianites, and sort of is able to appease them there. But he takes his 300 men and he turns northward after the two kings of Midian. And he comes to two towns in Gad that are unwilling to take sides, as Israel often does sort of in this timeline. And Gideon's heated, he's mad, and he says, I'm going to deal with you all after I'm done with these kings. So the two towns, they don't provide any sustenance to Gideon and his men. And so Gideon and his men continue to travel forward, and they capture, and Gideon kills these two kings, and he takes their crowns and the gold from their camels. He comes back to those two towns, and he deals with their unfaithfulness in a rather swift and hasty manner. And so through this, Gideon, with a small number of men, is able to completely take care of this consistent threat from these nomadic groups that would raid the Israelites, just completely decimate their land, take their camels in and feed from the Israelites' crop. And he's removed this threat, and Israel is elated by this. They're beside themselves, and they ask Gideon to be their king. And Gideon, to his credit, says no, that he's not interested in this, that God is their king. He does end up sort of accepting rule of Manasseh, and we do end up seeing that causing some issues. So he goes back with the gold from the crowns. He asks for a bunch of the earrings from the people that were the people that were attacked, because they were from the group from Ishmael, and so they all have earrings. And he takes all of this and he builds up an altar, which is going to cause issues later. And then among his 70 children, because of hereditary rule, we end up with a concern of who is going to take the place of Gideon once he dies. And so one of his sons, who's not really as much like the others, his mother comes from a group of people that are probably more sympathetic to the Midianites and the Amalekites. He goes in and he slaughters a number of Gideon's other sons, and he takes the throne, but then even his own town is resentful of him, and it causes issues. And just as quickly as Gideon delivered the Lord from the Midianites and the Amalekites, 40 years of peace, and then we see right back into their old ways. The Israelites are now back to worshiping Baal and worshiping Asherah poles. And so everything's sort of fallen apart because Gideon was unable to establish, a good kingship among the tribe of Manasseh, and for his line to continue. So what does this mean for us? What do we learn about biblical faith from all this? And what we can see first off is that when Gideon was called, he went. He went full force, so at whatever cost it would be. So Gideon was called by this angel of the Lord, and he says, I'm the least of people to do this. And the angel of the Lord says, you've been called, and so he did. And when he did go, he didn't care about the earthly ramifications. He put his life on the line when he tore down the altar to Baal, when he made a burnt offering out of the Asherah pole. And he put his life on the line when he went in with 300 against 120,000. But he didn't care about the earthly ramifications because he knew that he was being watched over by a greater power. And then finally, we know that despite his earthly faults and failures, he was still credited by the Hebrews writer as being righteous and faithful. That he made this list of great men despite the fact that things went back to the ways that they were. And so what we learn from this is that first, God is watching over his people, and while you are continuing to remain faithful, he will continue to watch out for you. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you will be given great things in this life and here on earth. And you know, the misinterpretation of Romans 8:28 is pervasive at times, and Philippians 4:13 is pervasive at times, in that we think that we deserve good things here on earth. And that's not what the call is. But we do know that God is looking out for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. We know that we have to live up to that faith that's been given to us. And so I hope what we learned is when Gideon called, he went. And so when we are called, and we have been, Matthew 28:19, we have been called, that we are to go. We know that Gideon, when he did go, he didn't care about earthly ramifications. We know that that is something that we also need to do, is to not care about what might happen to us here in this life and on earth, but we are to continue to live our lives according to the call that has been made to us. And then finally, we need to know that when we do fail, and we will continue to fail, that it's okay, that we are to pick ourselves up, because even these great men that have failed, we're still credited with righteousness, we're still credited with faithfulness, and made this list. And every single one that we've looked at has had problems that have arisen, but they were able to overcome those and to do something great for the kingdom of God. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you all continue to stay safe.